Shaquille O'Neal thought he knew his story, until a letter from Lucille shattered everything. Big Shaq was a name the world knew, but Jalen was the boy they buried in silence. Two mothers, one truth buried for 30 years. A hidden past, a stolen name, and a legacy built on love and survival. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Big Shaq's mother reveals a secret she kept for 30 years. His reaction will melt your heart. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Most people know him as Big Shaq, the towering legend, the walking billboard of strength, the millionaire with a grin wide enough to fill arenas. But the truth is, long before the lights, the laughter and the names stitched onto jerseys across the country, he was just Shaquille. And before even that, he was something else. Something not even he knew the name for yet. His mornings began before the sun, not because he had to, but because silence suited him. That was when the world was honest, when birds chirped without an audience, and the streets were still stretching their arms from sleep. Shaquille O'Neal, in a gray hoodie and scuffed sneakers, walked his block with the kind of reverence most reserved for sacred ground. He greeted every street vendor by name, every teen who dared make eye contact. His presence was quiet, but undeniable, like a mural you passed every day but only noticed when it disappeared. This was his ritual. Not for the cameras, not for the headlines. It was how he stayed grounded. Every Tuesday, he'd show up at the food bank 3 neighborhoods over. Unannounced, unloading trucks, packing boxes, even handing out bags to people who couldn't quite meet his eyes. And when he saw a mother flinch from embarrassment, he'd lower his voice and say, "You're not taking, you're teaching. Your kids are learning what strength really looks like." That's how he gave dignity, not just food. On paper, his life was full. Business ventures, speaking engagements, charity events. But in the corners of his heart, something old rattled. Something that felt like memory but didn't have a face. It didn't come often, just enough to remind him it was there. A flicker in the mirror. A chill in the chest when he passed at places. Like a book you once read as a child, but can't quite remember the title. Lucille, his mother, never said much about the past. She loved fiercely and deeply, but she didn't traffic in vulnerability. Eyes forward, she used to say. The past can't hug you, and he respected that. But lately he'd been noticing things, little things. A photo tucked behind another in a family frame. An old Southern hymn she hummed sometimes, one he'd never heard in their church. And sometimes, the way her hand would tremble when she watched the news, especially when the headlines turned to race, to pain, to names etched in injustice. It wasn't just Lucille. The world had changed, and Shaq felt it in his bones. Not in the headlines, but in the spaces between them. He watched neighborhoods that raised kings be erased for parking lots. He saw young boys with eyes like his used as statistics instead of stories. And sometimes when he mentored those kids, when he gave them his number and told them to call, he'd look into their faces and feel something odd. Not pity, not even empathy, but familiarity, like he was looking back in time. He had a name, a legacy, a family, but there were questions that never made it to the surface. Who was he before he was Big Shaq? Before the shoes, the slogans, the slam dunks. Who was he before his name was known? The public never saw the weight. They saw the smile, the charm, the laugh that could fill a stadium. But at night, when the lights shut off and the house went quiet, he'd lie awake and hear echoes. Not voices, not words, just echoes. Something unresolved. He once asked Lucille about his birth. She smiled, deflected, told a story about the day she brought him home from the hospital. But she didn't say who was there. She didn't mention a father, and when he pressed, she looked out the window like the answer was somewhere in the trees. "It's not what's behind you that makes you strong," she whispered. "It's what you build with what's in front." It was a good answer, but it wasn't the truth. Still, Shaq didn't push. He respected silence. He knew sometimes silence was a shield, and Lucille had needed all the shields she could find. A black woman raising a boy who'd grow to be a giant, not just in body but in spirit. She'd carried more than her share of storms. But one storm was still waiting, quiet, hidden, and it was coming. He didn't know it yet, but it had been circling for years, waiting for the right moment. And it would come not with fury, but with paper. A letter buried in the past, sealed with trembling hands, held back by love and fear in equal measure. That morning, as Shaq returned from his walk and stepped into his kitchen, The sun finally broke through the clouds. The light hit a photo on the fridge. Lucille holding him as a baby. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes were distant, as if already bracing for something. He stared at it longer than usual. There was a knock at the door. Lucille stood there, a small wooden box in her hands. No words. Just the box. Shaq took it. And somewhere deep inside he knew everything was about to change. The attic smelled like time. A warm, musty mix of old cedar wood, dust, and memory. Shaq had always hated it up there. As a kid. Too many shadows. Too many shapes that looked like people in the dark. But now, standing there at 40-something, his broad shoulders barely fitting between the slanted beams, he felt something different. Not fear, not nostalgia. Something quieter. Something still. Lucille was already up there, kneeling beside an old trunk that had been buried beneath boxes of holiday lights, faded photo albums, and a plastic bin full of basketball trophies she'd never let him toss. The cedar chest looked older than anything else in the room. Scratched, worn, the brass latch tarnished with time. She didn't say much when he came in, just gave a tired smile and motioned for him to come closer. I figured it was time, she said, her voice a little thinner than usual. Her hair was mostly gray now, pulled back with the same tortoiseshell clip she'd worn for years. Her eyes didn't meet his. They were fixed on the chest like it held a ghost she wasn't ready to see. Shaq knelt beside her, knees cracking under his weight. He looked at the chest and then at her. She didn't move, just lifted the lid slowly, like it might scream. Inside was nothing special at first glance. A stack of yellowing letters, a few old records, a church bulletin from 1989, and a velvet pouch he remembered playing with as a kid. But underneath all of that, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, was a letter, sealed, handwritten. His name was scrawled on the front in ink that had faded slightly but not enough to hide the tremble in the handwriting. Shaq. Not Big Shaq, not Shaq Diesel, just his name, plain and unadorned, like someone was trying to speak to the part of him the world didn't know. Lucille's hands hovered over the letter. She didn't touch it, just stared. Then finally, she spoke, quieter than before. I've been meaning to give you this for 30 years. Every year I told myself, next birthday, after graduation, after the kids, when you slowed down, when the world got quieter. But the world never did, and I kept waiting, and now I'm tired of waiting. Shaq didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just reached in and took the letter, holding it like it might fall apart if he gripped too tight. Lucille stood slowly. Her knees ached. He could tell, but she didn't ask for help. Never had. She moved toward the attic window, her silhouette framed by the soft afternoon light leaking in through the dusty glass. I never wanted to lie, she said, but sometimes love looks like silence. Sometimes truth is too loud for a child's ears. The words landed heavy, not like accusations, like confessions. Shaq glanced down at the letter again. It didn't feel like paper. It felt like history, and something inside him, some old ache he'd long ignored, started to throb. He slipped the letter into his jacket pocket. He didn't open it, couldn't. Not yet, not here. They didn't talk much on the way down. Lucille moved slowly, one hand on the banister. When they reached the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water, sat in her usual chair, the one near the window with the cushion she refused to replace, and stared out at nothing. Shaq stood for a while, his large frame casting a long shadow across the tile floor. The house felt different now, smaller, like it had shrunk around a truth that had been living in the walls too long. Lucille didn't press him to read it. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She just said one thing as he turned to leave. You'll know when it's time. The drive home felt longer than usual. The streets blurred past, familiar and foreign all at once. He passed the park where he used to shoot hoops alone, before school, the corner store where Mr. Bell used to give him free gum if he helped unload milk crates, places that made up the mosaic of his boyhood. But now every memory felt soft around the edges, like it might not be real, like it might belong to someone else. When he got home, he placed the letter on the mantel, just for now. Somewhere it could breathe, somewhere it could wait. He didn't touch it again that night. Instead, he went about his evening, like he always did, made a protein shake, scrolled through texts, watched a bit of the game, but everything felt a little off, like a song playing just slightly out of tune. Before bed, he stood in front of the fireplace, arms folded, staring at the letter like it might speak. But it didn't. It just sat there, silent and still. In the days that followed, He carried it with him. Not in his pocket, but in his mind. Every kind gesture he made, every handshake, every school he donated to, every speech he gave, all of it started to feel like it was orbiting this one thing he hadn't faced. This letter, this sealed secret that had waited 30 years to find him. People around him noticed the shift. His assistant asked if he was sleeping okay. His cousin mentioned he looked tired, but Shaq just smiled that same big smile and said, "I'm good. Just thinking." He wasn't lying. He was thinking about who wrote the letter, about what it said, about why Lucille had waited this long, about what kind of truth was big enough to hide for 3 decades, but delicate enough to fold in a single envelope. One afternoon he drove to the beach, not the flashy kind, a quiet stretch of shore 2 hours outside the city, the kind of place that didn't care who you were. He sat on a weathered bench, the letter in his hand, still sealed. The waves moved like breath, steady, unbothered, and there, under a sky that couldn't be rushed, he finally allowed himself to feel the weight. He didn't open the letter. Not yet, but he was closer now. And the silence around him wasn't hollow anymore. It was pregnant with possibility, with pain, with answers. Something was coming, and he was almost ready to meet it. It started with a sound, not loud, not sharp, just a siren in the distance. Shaq had heard thousands of them in his life, but this one felt different. It came through the open window while he was rinsing out his morning protein shaker, and something in the pitch caught the corner of his memory. He froze, bottle in hand, water running. For a second, the room disappeared, and he was a child again. A hallway, blue light flashing against the walls, a scream that didn't sound like Lucille's. The image vanished almost as quickly as it came, leaving him standing in his kitchen, chest tight, pulse racing. He'd always dismissed those flashes. Lucille had told him over and over when he was little. "You just dreamed that, baby." Probably saw something on TV. He'd believed her, of course he had. Why wouldn't he? But now, with that letter still unopened on his mantle, those words felt thin. Not lies, maybe, but not truth either. He found himself walking back to the hallway, opening the closet door where she kept the old albums, the boxes labeled in her handwriting, vacations, school days, family. He brought them to the dining room table, clearing space, laying each one out like forensic evidence. The first photo that struck him was from his 3rd birthday. He recognized the cake, the balloon arch, the clunky plastic fire truck he'd been obsessed with for months. But what caught him wasn't the party, it was the look in Lucille's eyes. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were somewhere else, like she was watching the photo being taken from another room inside herself. He flipped to the next page. Another birthday. Same expression. Then again at kindergarten graduation. At his first high school game. Always present, always supportive, but always holding something just out of reach. He turned to one of the smaller albums, the kind with adhesive pages and plastic overlays. Inside were a few hospital photos. No delivery room shots. No beaming new mother glow. Just him, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, eyes closed tight, and Lucille, sitting beside the bassinet in street clothes, not a gown. She looked tired, not in a way that said labor, but in a way that said waiting, or watching, or maybe worrying. That's when the edge of the memory returned. Sharper now, more detailed. A cold night, red and blue lights, strobing through slats of a window blind. A man's voice yelling, then a woman screaming, pleading. Actually, please don't take him, and a hand large and unfamiliar, pulling him away from the noise, wrapping him in something rough, carried down steps, into a car, the smell of smoke in the air, the metallic taste of fear on his tongue. It wasn't a dream, he was almost certain now. He pushed back from the table, palms flat against the wood. The room spun just slightly. That letter was still sealed, untouched, but its weight was growing by the hour, not just in his hands, but in the air around him. It was rewriting things already, bending the light around old memories, giving shape to shadows he'd lived with his whole life. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened his contacts. He scrolled down to Lucille's name, but didn't hit call. What would he even say? "Hey, I think I remember something you told me to forget." That didn't feel right. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted context, answers, maybe even comfort. But more than anything, he wanted to know who that woman was, the one screaming, and who the man was, the one who took him away from her. A thought landed so hard in his chest that he sat back down. What if Lucille hadn't been the one who took him in? What if someone else had pulled him from that house, and Lucille had been the one to catch him when he landed? He pulled another album from the stack. This one had a sticker on it. Church retreats. He flipped through the pages, skimming past group photos and choir robes, and potluck dinners. Then he stopped. There was a picture of Lucille standing next to a younger woman. Shaq had never seen her before. She was tall with deep-set eyes and a hesitant smile. There was something about her face, something that felt familiar, not in a clear way, more like the feeling you get standing in a room you once slept in, as a child. A haunting sense of "I've been here before." No name was written on the back. He stared at it for a long time, his thumb pressed into the edge of the photo sleeve. Was this her? Was this the woman from the memory? The timeline didn't match the story Lucille had always told. He'd been told he was born in a hospital just outside Newark. She'd said the delivery had been uneventful. But if that was true, why were there no newborn photos? No footprints, no birth certificate in any of these boxes, just a handful of snapshots that started after age 2. His stomach churned, not from anger, from dislocation, from the quiet realization that the floor he'd stood on his whole life might be plywood nailed over something much deeper and much darker. He sat back, eyes scanning the room like it might offer some clue. But the house was silent, too silent. And that silence no longer comforted him. He stood slowly, walked to the mantel, and stared at the letter again. Still sealed, still waiting. It hadn't changed, but everything else had. The questions weren't vague anymore. They were urgent, and they were multiplying. Who had he been before Lucille? Who had she been to him? And why had all these years passed without a single word? The letter held the answers, but he wasn't quite ready.
Not yet.
It happened on a Wednesday morning, when the sky was gray enough to press down on the shoulders. Shaq had been staring at the letter on the mantel for 2 days, each hour tightening its grip on his chest like a fist he couldn't open. There was no perfect time to tear into something that had waited 30 years to surface. No right mood, no ideal moment. But something in him had shifted. A line had been crossed in the quiet. The question wasn't if he'd open it, it was why he hadn't already. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Lucille had once spoon-fed him, mashed carrots, and made him recite spelling words. He cleared everything off. No distractions, no coffee, no phone, just the envelope and the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. He held it for a moment longer than necessary, thumb resting on the edge of the flap, then tore it open in one motion. Clean and absolute. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, the handwriting unmistakably Lucille's, round, careful, maternal. The first line hit him like the first step into deep water. My sweet boy, if you're reading this, then I finally found the courage I never had. He inhaled deeply, bracing himself. There's no way to soften what I'm about to say. I am not your birth mother. I have never been. I have loved you every second of your life, but the blood that runs in your veins is not mine. The words blurred for a moment, his eyes refusing to accept them. But he forced himself forward. You came to me in the middle of the night, wrapped in nothing but a hospital sheet and trauma. It was the summer of night. I was a young nurse working in a rural clinic in eastern Louisiana. I was tired, overworked, and trying to keep my head down in a world that didn't make room for black women to ask questions. That night, a baby was brought in by an officer. Shaq's hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them flat against the table, grounding himself. The officer didn't say much, just that there'd been a disturbance at a home on the south end, and your mother was unfit. That's what they said, unfit. But that wasn't the truth. He sat back, blinking hard, heart pounding. The truth is, there was a violent racial incident. Your mother, her name is Dolores Wade, was attacked after confronting a white landlord who had threatened her family. Things escalated. A fire was set. People were hurt. And the police, instead of protecting her, took you and told her you had died in the chaos. They told her it was over, and they made sure no one asked questions. But I did. His breath caught. I wasn't supposed to take you home. I wasn't supposed to see you again. But when I walked past the storage room where they had put your bassinet and saw you crying alone, I couldn't breathe. I called in a favor. The kind of favor you only ask once in a lifetime. A friend of mine knew someone who handled falsified birth records. I signed the forms, and just like that, you were mine. Shaq's vision blurred again, not from confusion, but from something sharper, deeper. Truth carving its initials into his chest. I raised you with everything I had. Every laugh, every lesson, every scraped knee and school award. You were never a secret to me, but the secret was always part of you. I kept it buried because I didn't know what it would do to you, because I was afraid. Afraid you'd hate me, afraid you'd want to leave. But mostly I was afraid that telling you would mean losing you. His grip on the letter tightened. You've always asked who your father was. I never had that answer. Dolores never told anyone. Maybe she was protecting you. Or maybe that truth was too much even for her to carry. I don't know. But I do know this. She never stopped looking for you. She's still alive. She's still in Easton. And I think you need to see her. A name. A place. A reality rearranged in just a few paragraphs. This isn't a goodbye, Shakia. I'm still your mother in every way that matters. But I owed you the truth. Even if it's 30 years too late. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you understand. But most of all, I hope you find her. The letter ended there. No signature. Just space. Space for him to sit in the rubble of revelation and decide what to do with it. He didn't move for a long time. His mind went blank, then rushed with noise. Images flickered. The night he'd remembered. The woman's scream. The way Lucille used to hum that strange lullaby when he was sick. One he could never find in any hymn book. It hadn't been hers. It had been Dolores's. He looked up at the mantel, where a photo of him and Lucille sat in a chipped ceramic frame. Her smile had always been a question. Now he finally understood why. He walked outside, the letter still in hand, and stood in the driveway under a sky that looked too small for the size of what he'd just learned. His life hadn't just shifted, it had cracked open. The foundation he'd trusted had been poured over another story, one he was only just beginning to read. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't check it. He looked up at the clouds, heavy and unmoving, and whispered something he hadn't said in decades. Jalen. The name didn't feel foreign. It felt returned, like a key he'd been carrying in his pocket without knowing there was a door. Somewhere out there, a woman named Dolores Wade was living with the weight of a lie told to her 30 years ago. Somewhere, she was waking up without knowing her son, the man the world called Shaq, was alive and reading the truth she'd been denied. And now he had a choice. He could go on being Big Shaq beloved, successful, untouchable, or he could become Jalen again. Even if it meant unraveling the entire fabric of his legacy to step into the story he'd been born from. He looked down at the letter one more time, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. Then he went inside and booked a flight to Louisiana. The road into eastern Louisiana was narrow and cracked, flanked by moss-draped oaks, and the kind of silence that felt lived in. Shaq kept the rental car slow, windows up, hood drawn low over his head. He didn't want to be noticed. He wasn't Big Shaq here. He wasn't the man who towered over stages and courts and television screens. Here he was a shadow following a trail 30 years cold, hoping it still led somewhere real. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Not his assistant, not his cousins, not even Lucille. Especially not Lucille. This part he had to face alone. Easton was small, the kind of town with one diner, 2 churches, and a gas station, where strangers got side-eyed before they even stepped out the car. But no one recognized him. No cameras, no autographs, just quiet. And the river. It curved like a question mark at the edge of town, slow-moving and muddy, heavy with stories. The address came from the letter. It wasn't written outright, but buried in a line Lucille had added at the end. The old fishing cabin, North Bend, past the cane fields. She's there most days. It was enough. The dirt path to the cabin was uneven, barely wide enough for the car. Shaq parked beneath a leaning pine tree and got out slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he approached the weather-beaten structure. The cabin was modest, wood peeled from years of rain and sun, a rusted screen door hanging crooked, but it wasn't empty. She was out back, standing barefoot at the water's edge, laundry basket balanced on her hip, shaking out a faded bedsheet in the wind. Her hair was mostly gray, pulled back tight, skin the color of walnut polished by weather and time. Her frame was wiry, strong in the way women get strong when they've had no choice. Shaq didn't speak right away. He watched her for a few seconds, trying to make the moment real. He'd seen her photo once, buried in a church album, unnamed, but here she was, alive, moving, breathing. He stepped forward, boots crunching over dry pine needles, She turned slowly, not startled, more like she'd known he was coming. Her eyes locked onto his, and something in them didn't blink. "You came," she said, soft, matter of fact. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know if he was supposed to cry, fall to his knees, apologize, run. His body stayed still, but inside he felt like he was breaking open. "You knew?" he asked, voice thick. She nodded, the sheet falling from her hands into the basket. "I always knew." They stood in silence for a moment, the river whispering behind them. She gestured toward the porch, and he followed her up the worn steps, the boards creaking beneath his weight. They sat in two sun-faded chairs with chipped arms. She lit a cigarette, held it between her fingers like it was memory itself, and began. "They told me you died," she said, staring out across the water. "Said the fire was too much, that no child could have made it. Said they found a body, and that was it. No funeral, no remains, just a lie, clean and quick." Shaq leaned forward, elbows on knees, trying to steady himself. "You were fighting for your family." Lucille said it started over a landlord. Dolores snorted, not amused. "Landlord didn't like that I was organizing other tenants. Tried to evict me. I stood my ground. So he made a call. Cops came. Whole thing turned ugly. I didn't back down. They didn't like that. When the fire started, I was pulled outside. You were still inside. I tried to go back in. They held me down. And then, they told me you were gone." "But I wasn't," he said quietly. "No," she replied, eyes finally meeting his. "You were taken, disappeared like a ghost in the smoke. I screamed for weeks, filed every report, traveled to every hospital. I even went to New Orleans to speak with a lawyer. Nothing. They made sure you vanished." He tried to speak, but there was a lump in his throat that wouldn't let go. He swallowed hard and asked, "Why didn't they just leave me with you?" "Because they didn't see me as a mother," she said, flicking ash into a chipped glass tray. "They saw a black woman making noise, causing trouble, asking for rights. And they figured the best way to shut me up was to take the one thing I couldn't replace." Shaq pressed a hand to his face, fighting the sting in his eyes. "I never called you Shaquille," she added. "Not once. Your name, the one I gave you, was Jalen. Jalen Wade." That name, the one that had come to him uninvited, whispered from somewhere buried. "I remember it," he whispered. "I didn't know why. I just knew it." Dolores nodded slowly. "You remembered me. Somewhere in there. Your soul remembered. They couldn't take that." They sat quietly for a long time. No more questions, just the dull ache of what had been lost. "I watched you grow up on TV," she said after a while, her voice softer. "You had your mother's strength, and her gentleness too. Lucille, she saved you. I'll never hate her for that. But I hated the silence, hated not knowing." Shaq turned to her, eyes searching. "You don't hate me." She looked at him with something deeper than love. "How could I? You're breathing. That's all I ever prayed for. And here you are." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, brushing the river into a shimmer. Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. The name Jalen still echoed in his head, not as a mystery anymore, but as something returned, something that fit in a way he hadn't expected. "Do you want to come with me?" he asked. "Back to Atlanta. Just for a while. Meet the kids. See where I live. Maybe we can start again." Dolores looked out at the river, then back at him. Her expression didn't shift, but something warm moved through her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not yet. This place, it holds the pieces of me I haven't finished gathering. But I'll come see you. When it's time, just knowing you're alive, that's enough for today." He nodded. He didn't push. He understood. Before he left, she pressed something into his hand. A locket, tarnished. Inside, a tiny photo of a baby in a hospital blanket. Eyes closed, mouth open in mid-cry. "I held you that day for just a minute," she said, "and it was enough to last 30 years. Shaq walked back to his car with the locket in one hand, and a name, Jalen, settling into place inside him like a seed, finally planted. The river behind him kept flowing, slow and steady, like time, like memory, like truth. The return flight to Atlanta was quiet. Shaq didn't speak to the man beside him, didn't eat the airline meal, didn't even glance at his phone. He just stared out the window, the clouds below him like soft reminders that nothing about the world was solid anymore. The seatbelt pressed against his chest, but it wasn't the tightest thing he felt. That weight belonged to the truth he was carrying back with him, a truth he hadn't yet figured out how to live with. When he stepped off the plane, sunglasses pulled low and hoodie pulled tight, there was no one waiting for him. That had been deliberate. He didn't want a driver. He didn't want a handler. He didn't want to answer questions, especially not the one echoing in his own chest. What now? The drive home felt different. Every billboard with his face on it, every commercial that buzzed through the radio with his voice, felt like a stranger waving from a distance. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was just detached, like he'd stepped outside of his life and was watching it from the sidewalk, wondering how it all looked so familiar but no longer felt like his. He pulled into the driveway, his mansion standing quiet and pristine, the lawn trimmed, the windows gleaming, the kind of perfection that now felt like it was built over a sinkhole. He walked through the door, and everything looked the same. But he wasn't. The letter was still on the mantel. He didn't touch it, didn't need to. It had already done its job. For the next few days, Shaq moved through life like a man in molasses. He did what he had to, answered emails, recorded a short message for one of his youth programs, called his agent to confirm a charity appearance, but everything was off-tempo. His team sensed it. They asked if he was tired. He said yes. They asked if he was sick. He said no. But no one asked if he was broken. That question lingered in silence. Lucille called twice. He didn't answer. He told himself it was because he didn't know what to say. But the truth was deeper. He was afraid that hearing her voice would make him collapse into pieces too heavy to hold. It wasn't anger he felt. It wasn't betrayal. It was mourning. He was grieving the version of himself that had lived unbothered by questions. The man who thought he knew the shape of his life. The man who thought he was whole. Now, everything he'd built, every speech about where he came from, every foundation that bore his name, every story he told in interviews about growing up in a strong black home, felt haunted. Because half of it was built on silence. Not lies, but omission. And he didn't know if that was better or worse. He stood in his home gym one morning, looking at the walls lined with awards, photos, and jerseys. Every image of him smiling, flexing, posing. It all looked like a mask. Not fake, but incomplete. The world saw Big Shaq, the guy who turned his fame into philanthropy, who turned his pain into purpose. But they didn't see the boy who had been stolen in the night. The name Jalen still rang in his ears like a song he wasn't allowed to sing. The breakdown wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with yelling or shattered glass. It came one morning when he sat on his back patio and found himself crying into a cup of cold coffee. Quiet, steady tears, no heaving sobs, no gasping, just water spilling from somewhere too deep to name. That afternoon, he called Lucille. She picked up on the first ring. Neither of them spoke right away. Finally, he said, "I saw her." Lucille's breath caught. "And?" "She remembered me," he said, "called me Jalen." Silence again. "She still lives by the river," he added, "washes her sheets by hand, smokes the same brand you do." Lucille chuckled, weakly. She always did hate machines. There was another pause, heavier this time. Then he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me she was still alive?" Lucille exhaled. "Because I didn't know if she was. And by the time I found out, you were already Big Shaq. You had the world looking at you like a superhero. I didn't know how to unravel that." "I would have listened." "I know," she said. "But I didn't want you to choose between her and me." "I didn't," he said. "I'm not going to." And then for the first time in a long while, Lucille let herself cry, not from guilt, but from the relief of being seen, fully, even in her failures. A week later, it happened. A journalist from an online tabloid reached out to Shaq's team with a question, innocent enough on the surface. "Is it true Shaquille visited Easton, Louisiana last week for personal reasons?" It wasn't an accusation. Not yet. But the scent was in the air. Someone had noticed. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone at the small gas station, maybe a photo snapped by a passing driver. Shaq's publicist called in a panic, her voice a mix of concern and confusion. "Do we need to get ahead of this? Is there something personal we should be aware of?" He almost said no. Almost slipped into the old habit of guarding everything. But then he looked in the mirror and saw Jalen, looking back. Not instead of Shaq. Alongside him. I'll handle it, he said calmly. He sat down at his desk that night, opened his laptop and started writing. Not a press release, not a statement crafted for spin, just a letter, a public letter. Addressed not to the media, not to fans, but to the kid who'd once been lost, and to every other child like him who'd been hidden, buried or forgotten by systems that never cared. He titled it, The Truth Behind the Name. In it he told everything. The memory, the letter, the trip, the locket, the real mother, the real name. He didn't defend. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth with the kind of grace only a man who has lived through fire can muster. By morning, it was everywhere. The mask of Big Shaq had cracked wide open, and what emerged wasn't smaller. It wasn't weaker. It was something raw, something real, something red. The headline dropped on a Monday morning, like a match in dry grass. Big Shaq's real mother found. Identity lies revealed. Beneath it, a photo snapped from behind a pine tree showed Shaq's unmistakable frame standing beside a woman near a riverbank. The article came from a fringe tabloid site, but within hours it was everywhere. Reposted, repackaged, repeated with even less care each time. Networks picked it up. Radio hosts speculated. Morning talk shows ran dramatic segments with spinning graphics and cheap piano music. It wasn't the truth they ran with. It was the version they could sell.
They framed it like a betrayal.
Not by systems or history, but by people. They painted Dolores as the tragic biological mother who'd been denied justice by a woman they now called the nurse who stole Shaq. The narrative was catchy. Too catchy, it left no room for nuance. No time for breath. Lucille's face, once admired as the matriarch behind the man, now flashed across screens under captions like "The Woman Who Lied" and "Shaq's Secret Mother, Hero or Thief." They dragged her name through opinion panels and tabloid threads with the kind of venom reserved for people they didn't believe could fight back. And Dolores, despite never granting an interview, despite staying quiet, was suddenly everywhere, framed in high-contrast filters with gospel music swelling underneath. She became a symbol. The resilient black mother. The woman who never gave up. The world made her into a statue overnight, not caring whether she wanted that pedestal or not. Shaq watched it all unfold in silence. He saw how the media twisted pain into product, how every fact was stretched into drama, how two women, his mothers, were thrown into roles written by strangers who hadn't lived a minute of their truth. The comments online were worse. Brutal, anonymous cruelty buried under usernames and fake names. Some accused Lucille of kidnapping. Others said Shaq had built his empire on a false identity. A few claimed the whole story was fabricated for publicity. And underneath it all, an undercurrent of something older, something familiar. Racism. The kind that never left. Just changed clothes. It showed up in the way pundits questioned Dolores's memory. In the way Lucille's decades of parenting were reduced to a secret. In how no one blamed the system that tore Jalen from his mother in the first place. Shaq felt the anger, yes, the heat in his chest, the fire in his palms, but he didn't let it lead. Instead, he let the ache settle, breathe, and speak. He waited 3 days. Then, at noon on Thursday, he called a press conference. No handlers, no filters, just a single microphone, a folding chair, and a quiet room filled with reporters. He stepped up in a plain black hoodie. No logos, no cameras in tow, just him, and truth. He didn't read from a statement. Didn't rehearse. He just talked. "When I was a child," he began, voice steady, "I believed my life started the day Lucille O'Neill brought me home. And in many ways, it did. She gave me everything. She raised me with love, discipline, faith, and sacrifice. But I've recently learned that my story didn't begin there. It began before memory, with a woman named Dolores Wade." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "I wasn't taken by Lucille. I was saved by her. She didn't steal me. She shielded me. From a system that wanted to erase me. From the fire that almost ended me. I was told my mother had died. That was a lie. But it wasn't Lucille's lie. It was the lie of a world that didn't want a strong black woman standing up for her child." Some of the reporters shifted in their seats. The cameras clicked. But Shaq's voice didn't waver. "I found Dolores. I heard her truth. And I embraced it. She is my mother. And so is Lucille. I am not split between them. I am built by both of them. You don't have to pick sides when your heart has room for two kinds of love." He took a breath. Deeper now. I see the headlines. I see the way you try to flatten this into something scandalous. But this isn't about betrayal. It's about survival. It's about what happens when black families are torn apart and expected to stay silent. It's about how we carry secrets to protect the ones we love, and how the truth when it comes shouldn't be weaponized. It should be honored. He looked straight into the cameras then, his eyes clear. So here it is. I am Shaquille O'Neal. I am also Jalen Wade, and my legacy isn't built on lies. It's built on love that fought to survive in the dark. For 30 years. He stepped away. No questions. No closing remarks. Just truth. By that evening, the story had changed again. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough. Some headlines began to shift their tone. Editorials were rewritten. A few talk show hosts issued apologies. Clumsy but sincere. Social media lit up with people, especially black families, sharing their own stories of lost roots, of mothers separated from sons, of truths hidden for survival. And Dolores, still in Easton, sent a message through Shaq's team. Just 2 words. Thank you. Lucille, too, reached out that night. Her voice was shaky, but she managed to say what needed saying. You gave them the truth. Not for you. For all of us. Shaq stood in his kitchen, staring out at the yard lit by moonlight. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt seen, and in this world, that was everything. There was still more to do. The story wasn't over. But for the first time, the story was his. It took Shaq weeks to find the right day. Not because of scheduling, not because of distance, but because there are some meetings so weighted, so full of history and unspoken truth, that time itself has to prepare. He didn't rush it. He waited until the quiet between his 2 mothers no longer felt like a wall, but like an opening. The house he chose was his own, not the big one with the glass elevators and guest wings, but the older one he kept on the edge of town. It was quiet, lived in, wrapped in oak trees, and shaded like a memory. He wanted a place where they could breathe, where they wouldn't feel watched. No reporters, no cameras, just 3 people tied by a storm the world had only recently started to understand. Lucille arrived first. She stepped out of the car slowly, her purse clutched like armor. She wore the same light blue sweater she'd worn to his high school graduation, as if pulling something familiar around her could protect her from the weight of the day. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear but with anticipation so sharp it almost bled. Dolores arrived 10 minutes later. She came alone. No driver. No makeup. Just her in the quiet grace of a woman who had walked through every kind of fire, and still stood tall. She wore a simple dark green dress, and carried a small paper bag. The top rolled neatly. Shaq would later learn it held a jar of homemade peach preserves, something her own mother used to make for guests when she didn't know what else to offer. He met each of them at the door, but gave no speeches, no introductions. Instead, he led them both into the sitting room, where the light was soft and the air still. The chairs were placed facing each other, with a small table in between on it, a pitcher of iced tea, 3 glasses, and nothing else. The silence as they sat was thick enough to feel. It wasn't hostile, just old, like it had been waiting decades to exhale. Lucille spoke first. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I've imagined this day more times than I can count.
Dolores looked at her directly.
So have I. Another beat passed. Then Lucille leaned forward, her hands clasped tight. I never meant to steal him, she said. I swear to God. I didn't even know the truth at first. They brought him in, small, bruised, alone, and they told me he had no family. I believed them. I shouldn't have. But I did. Dolores didn't blink. And when you learned the truth, Lucille's voice cracked. By then I had already fallen in love with him. He was my son in every way that mattered. And I was scared. Scared to lose him. Scared they'd take him back and destroy what little piece he had left. She looked down, then back up. Her eyes were full. Not with excuses, but with something heavier. I'm sorry, she said. Not just for keeping him. For not looking harder. For not telling him sooner. For letting my fears speak louder than your pain. I carried that silence like a stone in my chest every day. Dolores didn't rush to reply. She let the words settle. Then she took a slow sip of the tea, set her glass down gently, and exhaled. You gave him a life I couldn't, she said. Not because I didn't want to, but because the world wouldn't let me. They took him from me to punish me for speaking up, for being too loud, too black, too proud. You didn't do that. The system did. But you still had a choice. Lucille nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know, she whispered. I should be angry, Dolores continued. And I was, for years, but then I watched him grow. Saw him become a man with kindness in his eyes, strength in his voice, and I knew that came from you too. You didn't just keep him. You raised him, and you loved him. She paused. So I forgive you, not because I have to, but because I've seen who he's become. And because holding on to hate never brought a child home. Lucille broke then. Not loudly. Just a slow, breathless sob that shook through her shoulders like wind through old branches. Shaq moved to her side, resting a massive hand on her back, grounding her. Dolores sat still, but her presence filled the room like a heartbeat. She reached into the paper bag and pulled out the jar. These are from the peach tree behind my cabin, she said. I don't have much, but I wanted to bring something. My mother used to say you don't show up empty-handed to a hard conversation. Lucille took it with both hands, her lips trembling around a thank you. She couldn't quite form, and then they sat. No more apologies, no more declarations. Just three people breathing the same air, sitting in the same space where truth had finally found its way through. The clock ticked softly in the background, the only sound in a room that held decades of silence. Shaq leaned back, his chest rising slow, his eyes moving between them. For so long he had been split. One man, two names, two stories. But here in this room, that fracture didn't feel like a break. It felt like a bridge. They didn't need to fix anything. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be carried. And in that moment, all three of them carried the same thing. The weight of racism, the cost of survival, the strength of motherhood. When Dolores stood to leave, Lucille stood too. There was no hug, no forced closeness. But they looked at each other like two women who had finally been seen. And that was enough. At the door, Dolores turned to Shaq and touched his cheek lightly. Don't forget her, she said, motioning to Lucille. I couldn't, he said. She's a part of me. Just like you. As she left, Lucille watched her go through the window, her eyes soft with something that looked like peace and pain folded together. Shaq stood beside her, arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, said nothing. There was nothing more to say. They had finally arrived at the part of the story where silence wasn't about hiding. It was about understanding. The bleachers were full long before tip-off. The gym echoed with laughter, music, and the squeak of sneakers on polished hardwood. It wasn't a pro arena, not tonight. This was a converted high school court, in the middle of a community that knew Shaquille O'Neal, not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor. Flyers had gone out weeks in advance. One court, one story, one community. But even those words didn't capture what this night had grown to mean. This wasn't a charity event. It wasn't a press play. It was a reckoning wrapped in celebration. A chance to tell a different kind of story. One built not on shame or secrecy, but truth reclaimed. Shaq had designed the evening himself. Every detail mattered. The event was free, open to everyone. Local food trucks lined the parking lot. A jazz trio played before the games. The scoreboard didn't light up with numbers. It displayed names, names of missing children, forgotten mothers, families torn by silence and stitched together again by memory. At center court was the logo for his new foundation, Jalen's Bridge. Not just a name, a declaration. When he finally stepped out from the tunnel, dressed not in a suit, but in a simple black tee, with the foundation's name across the chest, the crowd rose as one. It wasn't just applause, it was recognition. They saw him now, not just Big Shaq, but Jalen too. And for the first time both names belonged on the same shoulders. He stood at the free throw line, mic in hand, the crowd falling into a hush that felt sacred. I used to think this court was my entire story, he began, voice calm and open. I thought the game gave me my name, my legacy, my life. But I was wrong. It wasn't this court that made me, it was two women who never gave up on me, even when the world tried to erase our connection. He paused, turning slightly to gesture toward the front row. There, sitting side by side, were Lucille and Dolores. No spotlight, no special seating, just two mothers, hands resting in their laps, eyes forward. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't have to. The silence said everything. I call them both Mom, Shaq said, because both of them saved me. One gave me life, the other gave me a future, and I wouldn't be here without either of them. He stepped back, voice breaking slightly, but steady. Jalen's bridge is for all the kids like me. Stolen, hidden, or forgotten. It's for the mothers who were told their grief didn't matter. It's for the families still searching. We're building a platform to uncover stories buried by broken systems. We'll provide legal help, DNA tracing, emotional counseling, everything needed to reconnect those lost lines. A low murmur of emotion rippled through the room. Heads nodded, eyes welled. Even the teenagers, usually restless, sat still. Shaq lifted the mic one last time. This isn't about guilt. This is about healing. And we're gonna do it together. One name at a time. One story at a time. One shot at a time. He handed the mic off, walked to the three-point line, and motioned for a ball. A kid tossed it to him. 12, scrappy, grinning like he just passed the rock to a legend. Shaq caught it, bounced once, lined up his shot, and let it fly. It swished. The crowd erupted, not because he made the shot, but because they knew what it meant. The games began, but no one kept score. Teams rotated. Kids, local coaches, retired pros who'd flown in just to show support. In one corner, a photo booth let families print portraits with the hashtag #GanFoundAgain. In another, volunteers handed out story cards, each one detailing a real case of a child separated from their birth parents due to systemic injustice. At halftime, they rolled out a single folding chair and a spotlight. One by one, people stepped into it and shared their own stories. A woman from Houston who found her brother after 40 years. A man from Baton Rouge who discovered the aunt who raised him wasn't his aunt at all, but his birth mother. Each voice stitched another thread into the fabric, being rewoven in real time. Dolores and Lucille sat still through it all. Every once in a while, their eyes would meet, tentative, but no longer strained. They didn't speak much that night, but they didn't need to. They had said what needed to be said. Now they were witnessing the ripple of their shared truth moving through the lives of strangers who suddenly didn't feel so alone. Toward the end of the evening, Shaq walked out to midcourt again. He wasn't holding a mic, just the same locket Dolores had given him. Still tarnished, still heavy. He opened it, looked at the photo inside, then looked out at the crowd. "I was never meant to be a statistic," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "But I almost was. That's why this matters." And then he placed the locket on a small stand by the scorer's table. Beneath a glass box etched with one sentence: "Every child deserves to be remembered." The night ended without fanfare. No confetti, no fireworks, just hugs, conversations, a line of people signing up to volunteer, and a gym full of people who had been reminded that family isn't just biology. It's survival. It's love. It's truth finally spoken aloud. As the crowd cleared, Shaq walked over to his mothers. They stood, one on each side. He took their hands, Lucille's in his right, Dolores's in his left, and held them there. No cameras caught the moment. No reporters asked questions. But in that stillness between the woman who raised him and the woman who birthed him, he felt whole. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was standing on two separate courts. He was finally playing on one. The lake was still that morning. Not flat, not mirror-like, just still, the way something becomes when it has nothing left to prove. Shaq stood at the water's edge, his hands in the pockets of a light windbreaker. The sun slow to rise behind a blanket of pine trees. The air smelled of damp earth and memory. It was the kind of morning that made no noise, that demanded nothing, that simply was. He didn't wear his rings today. No logo on his jacket. No watch on his wrist. He wasn't here as Big Shaq. He wasn't here as a businessman, a celebrity, or a foundation figurehead. He was just himself, and that was finally enough. Lucille stood on his right, Dolores on his left. The two women didn't speak, but they didn't have to. They watched the sun peek through the trees, in shared silence, the kind only people bound by unshakable truth can sit in. Neither reached for his hand, but he felt their presence like roots at his feet, grounding him. The ground beneath them sloped gently toward the lake, and at the base of the hill, surrounded by a small semicircle of white stones, stood a plaque. Simple. Weather-sealed, mounted on a cedar post. Jalen Shaquille O'Neal, son of two mothers, a life reclaimed. He'd chosen the words carefully, not as a headline, not as a legacy, but as an acknowledgement of what was lost, and what had been found. He closed his eyes for a moment, let the breeze move across his face, and then began to speak, not loudly, just enough for them both to hear. "There was a time I thought I was made of two different lives, that I had been split down the middle. One side Jalen, the boy I never got to be, and the other Shaquille, the man the world came to know. I thought maybe I'd been built on a fracture. His voice was steady, not rehearsed, spoken like someone who had wrestled with the truth long enough to be at peace with its shape. But I wasn't two people, he said, pausing to breathe. I was just waiting to meet myself. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying his words somewhere into the quiet. I used to think identity was something you wore, he continued, like a number on your jersey, or a nickname people gave you. But it's not. It's something you uncover, layer by layer, sometimes painfully, sometimes quietly, sometimes with the help of two women who gave everything to protect the boy they both loved. Dolores turned to look at him, her face soft but unreadable. Lucille, too, stood still, her eyes wet but proud. Neither woman needed his gratitude. But they received it anyway, in his presence, in his peace, in the way he stood between them without flinching. He stepped forward and knelt by the plaque. He placed something at its base. A photo slightly faded, now mounted in a weather-safe frame. It was of him as a baby, sleeping on Lucille's lap. Next to it, a second photo, newer him and Dolores, standing by the river, side by side, hands touching, eyes steady. Two pictures, one boy. He rose slowly, dusting off his knees, then looked back at the women who had become his beginning and his return. Jalen never disappeared, he said, voice low. He was just waiting in the quiet. There were no speeches, no cameras, no articles being written. Just the sound of water against the rocks and birds waking in the trees. They stayed a while, not talking, just being. That was all the morning asked for. That was all it gave. When they finally turned to leave, Shaq lingered a moment longer, one hand resting lightly on the cedar post, the other pressing against his heart, not out of pain, but recognition. He didn't need to search anymore. He wasn't divided. He was found, and for the first time the name Jalen didn't feel like a secret he had to protect. It felt like home. If this story stirred something in you, it was meant to. Across America, untold truths still sit in silence, waiting to be heard. Join us in uncovering the names, the families, the legacies that history tried to erase. This isn't just about the past, it's about who we choose to be now. Stand with truth, walk with memory, help rewrite what should have never been forgotten.